They demanded I pay $250,000 in fines for violations of their HOA regulations over the past 5 years, plus legal fees and unauthorized construction penalties they made up themselves, all on the very land I inherited. The funny part? It turns out they were the ones who built houses on my property. Hey, where are you watching from? Drop a comment below and let me know. And don't click away just yet, because this is only the beginning of a battle where I, an engineer suddenly turned Montana rancher, had to face off against a powerful HOA board with connections throughout the county. When they threatened to put a lien on my grandfather's ranch, I rolled up my sleeves and did something no one else had dared to do. I never thought I'd be fighting for a piece of land I wasn't even sure I wanted to keep. 6 months ago, I was Mike Carson, a 35-year-old software engineer living in Seattle. Then the tech downturn happened, and suddenly my comfortable 6-figure job disappeared, along with thousands of others in the industry. The startup I'd poured 3 years of my life into collapsed overnight when our funding dried up. I still remember our CEO's face during that final all-hands meeting, a mixture of defeat and disbelief as he explained there was no money left for severance. Just like that, I was unemployed with rent due in 2 weeks and Seattle's notoriously high cost of living breathing down my neck. I started applying for jobs immediately, but the market was flooded with talented engineers, all competing for the few positions that remained. 2 weeks into my unexpected unemployment, I received the news that my grandfather, James Carson, had passed away at 89. We were close when I was a kid, but as adult life took over, my visits to his Montana ranch became less frequent. The call from his lawyer hit me hard. Not just because I'd lost the man who taught me to fish and ride horses during those childhood summers, but because he'd left his entire 100-acre ranch to me, his only grandchild. I drove out to Montana with mixed feelings. The ranch held beautiful memories, but I knew nothing about running one, and honestly, I was planning to clean it up, sell it, and use the money to restart my life in Seattle. The drive from Washington to Montana gave me plenty of time to reminisce about summers spent following my grandfather around as he mended fences, tended to his small herd of cattle, and told me stories about how the land had been in our family for generations. As a kid, I'd loved every minute of it. As an adult, I saw it through different eyes. The peeling paint on the barn, the outdated equipment, the isolation. But when I pulled into the long gravel driveway, something felt different. The sprawling landscape was just as I remembered. Wide open fields, the small barn, and Grandpa James's modest 2-bedroom house sitting on a gentle slope overlooking a creek. What was new was the sea of identical luxury homes I could see in the distance, just beyond what I thought was our property line. The house was exactly as Grandpa had left it, down to the half-empty coffee mug in the sink. Dust had settled over everything, and there was an emptiness that went beyond the physical absence of my grandfather. His worn leather recliner sat by the window overlooking the fields, a book still open on the side table as if he'd just stepped out for a moment. I ran my fingers over his old desk, remembering how he'd sit there in the evenings writing in his journal. As I was sorting through some papers on his desk, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find an elderly woman, probably in her 70s, with steel gray hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the kind of tanned, weathered skin that comes from decades of outdoor work. "You must be James's grandson," she said without preamble. "I'm Barbara Thompson, Barb, your grandfather's neighbor for 30 years. Heard you inherited the place." Her handshake was surprisingly firm. James was a good man, one of the few around here who stood his ground when those vultures came circling. Before I could ask what she meant, she pointed to the bright white envelope I'd found stuck in the door when I arrived. I hadn't opened it yet, assuming it was a condolence card or something from the local church. "You might want to read that," she said. "Been happening to James for months before he passed. One of the reasons his health took a turn, if you ask me." I tore open the envelope while Barb made herself comfortable at the kitchen table, clearly settling in for what she expected to be a lengthy conversation. Inside was an official-looking letter from something called the Sun Valley Homeowners Association, demanding immediate payment of $250,000 for accumulated violations, legal fees, and unauthorized construction penalties dating back 5 years. The letter included a detailed breakdown, $75,000 for failure to maintain property to community standards, $50,000 for unauthorized agricultural activity in a residential zone, $40,000 for improper fencing and boundary markers, and a whopping $85,000 in legal fees and administrative costs. The letter threatened to place a lien on the property if payment wasn't received within 30 days. "What the hell is this?" I asked, scanning the document in disbelief. "Grandpa's ranch isn't part of any housing development, And what violations? This house has looked the same for 40 years. Barb snorted. That's Victoria Reynolds and her Sun Valley HOA. About 5 years ago, they started developing that fancy community you saw on your way in. Started small, but they've been expanding like a cancer. Your grandfather refused to sell when they came knocking, and they've been trying to force him out ever since. Started claiming parts of his land were actually within their development boundaries and that he was violating their precious rules. I sat down heavily across from her. But how can they just claim land that isn't theirs? There must be property records, surveys. That's exactly what your grandfather said, Barb replied, a glint of approval in her eyes. He was fighting this, was convinced something wasn't right with their surveys. He was collecting evidence when his heart gave out. She hesitated, then continued more quietly. James told me if anything happened to him, I should make sure you knew about the boundary issue. Said there was a folder in his study marked Boundaries with an old map. Said you'd be smart enough to figure it out. Did he talk to a lawyer? I asked, still trying to process that my inheritance came with $250,000 in bogus fines. Tried to, Barb said, her expression darkening. But Victoria's got half the lawyers in the county on retainer for one thing or another, and the few who aren't directly working for her are scared to cross her. Your grandfather was going to drive to Billings to find someone there when She trailed off, and I nodded, understanding. I spent the next few hours digging through my grandfather's remarkably organized files until I found it, a worn manila folder with boundaries written in his shaky handwriting. Inside was a tattered map of the original property from 1952 when my great-grandfather purchased it, along with more recent survey documents and notes in Grandpa's handwriting questioning the current boundary markers. There were also photographs of old fence posts and stone markers that had apparently marked the original property line, some of which now sat well within what appeared to be the Sun Valley development. Looking at the documents, I could see why he was suspicious. The property line on the newer documents seemed to have shifted significantly compared to the original map. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about my grandfather's final months, alone and being harassed by this HOA, believing his land was being stolen but unable to find help. I thought about my own situation, unemployed, without prospects, and now facing a legal battle I hadn't asked for. Part of me wanted to just sell the place and wash my hands of it all, but another part, a part that sounded suspiciously like my grandfather, kept whispering that some things were worth fighting for. The next morning, with Barb in tow for moral support, I headed to the county records office. The building was an imposing brick structure that had probably been impressive in the 1950s, but now looked tired and underfunded. The employee at the desk, Jenny, was a local fixture who'd been working there for decades and remembered my grandfather fondly. James was in here a lot in his final months, she told us as she pulled up the digital records. He was convinced something was fishy with that new development's boundary claims. She lowered her voice. Between us, a lot of longtime residents feel the same way about Victoria Reynolds. She's got money and connections, and things tend to go her way around here, if you know what I mean. She turned the monitor so we could see. This is the official county survey from 1952 when your great-grandfather bought the place. And this, she pulled up another document, is the survey that Sun Valley Development submitted in 2019 when they began construction on Phase 2 of their project. The difference was immediately apparent. According to the original survey, my grandfather's property extended a good 300 yards further than what the new survey showed, right into what was now the newest section of the Sun Valley development. Can we get an independent survey done to confirm this? I asked. Jenny nodded. Already got a call in to Bill Matthews. He's the most respected surveyor in the county and more importantly has no business ties to Victoria Reynolds or Sun Valley. He can be out there tomorrow morning. This seems unusually helpful, I said, suspicious of how smoothly this was going. Jenny smiled. Your grandfather had a lot of friends around here, Mr. Carson, more than he probably realized. People who'd like to see things made right. Bill arrived at 8 a.m. sharp the next day, a taciturn man in his 60s who spoke mainly in grunts as he set up his equipment. He had the weathered look of someone who'd spent his life outdoors, and hands covered in calluses that spoke of physical work despite his professional occupation. For hours we walked the property as he took measurements, consulted GPS coordinates, and made notes. I tried making conversation, but Bill was a man who believed in doing his job with minimal chatter. By mid-afternoon, he was ready to deliver his verdict. Based on the original property markers, county records, and GPS confirmation, he said, pointing to a map he'd spread out on the hood of his truck, approximately 10 acres of what's currently being used as part of the Sun Valley development is actually on your land, Mr. Carson. That includes about 15 homes in their newest section and half of their clubhouse. I felt a surge of anger mixed with vindication. So they built houses on my grandfather's land, then had the nerve to fine him for violations? Bill shrugged. Wouldn't be the first time a developer tried to move boundary lines to their advantage, but this one's particularly egregious. You've got a solid case here. He folded up his maps with practiced precision. I'll have the official report to you by tomorrow, properly notarized. You'll want a good lawyer. That's the problem, I said. According to my neighbor, Victoria Reynolds has most of the local legal talent tied up. Bill grunted. Call Ben Hawkins in Billings. He's my brother-in-law, tough son of a gun who specializes in property disputes. Tell him I sent you. With that, he packed up his equipment and was gone, leaving me standing in my grandfather's field with a head full of plans. Armed with Bill's official report, I drove straight to the Sun Valley HOA office, an ostentatious building designed to look like a rustic mountain lodge, though every inch of it screamed new money. Inside, a waterfall feature dominated the lobby, and tasteful landscape photographs of Montana hung on the walls. The receptionist, a young woman with a perfect blowout and a practiced smile, looked me over with barely concealed disdain when I mentioned my grandfather's property. Ms. Reynolds is extremely busy, she told me. If this is about the violations notice, you can submit an appeal in writing to the HOA board. It's about more than that, I replied, keeping my tone polite but firm. I have evidence that Sun Valley has been building on Carson property. I think Ms. Reynolds will want to discuss this directly. The mention of evidence changed her demeanor. After a hushed phone call, she led me to a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the development. Behind an imposing desk sat Victoria Reynolds, a polished woman in her mid-40s wearing what looked like $1,000 suit and a smile that never reached her eyes. Her dark hair was cut in a severe bob that framed a face beautiful in a cold, calculating way. Everything about her radiated control and confidence. Mr. Carson, what a pleasure to finally meet you, she said, not bothering to stand. I was sorry to hear about your grandfather. James was resistant to progress, shall we say. I hope you'll prove more reasonable about joining our community. I placed Bill's survey report on her desk. I think you've been building your community on land that doesn't belong to you, Ms. Reynolds. Her smile tightened almost imperceptibly as she glanced at the document without touching it. Oh, an independent survey, how quaint. Our development was approved by county planners based on professional surveys conducted by the most reputable firm in the state. A firm your company happens to have on retainer, I countered, remembering what Barb had told me. Victoria leaned back in her chair, a hint of amusement crossing her face. Mr. Carson, you've been in town, 2 days? And you're already throwing around accusations based on some old maps? And the word of a surveyor who's probably a friend of your grandfather's? That's not how we do business here. How do you do business, Miss Reynolds? By fabricating violations against properties you want to acquire? By moving boundary lines when it suits you? Victoria leaned back in her chair. Mr. Carson, I understand you're upset. Losing a family member can make people irrational. But throwing around baseless accusations isn't going to change the fact that your grandfather's property has numerous code violations that need to be addressed. That's why we've been forced to impose those unfortunate fines. Fines for violations on land that isn't even part of your HOA? That seems legally questionable. Her smile vanished entirely. Let me be clear, Mr. Carson. Sun Valley is the economic future of this county. We bring in tax revenue, create jobs, and raise property values. Your grandfather's dilapidated ranch is an eyesore that's holding back progress. We've been more than patient, but my patience has limits. Pay the fines, or we'll put a lien on the property, and eventually you'll lose it altogether. She stood up, signaling the meeting was over. Or you could save yourself the trouble and sell to us now. We're prepared to offer a fair market price. As the receptionist appeared to escort me out, Victoria added with artificial sweetness, Do think about it, Mr. Carson. A software engineer like yourself has no business playing farmer. This could be a win-win for everyone. I was seething as I drove back to the ranch. How did she know I was a software engineer? It seemed Victoria Reynolds had done her homework on me. Back at the house, Barb was waiting on the porch swing, and I filled her in on the confrontation. That woman's been trying to buy up all the old ranches and farms around here for years, Barb explained. Offers lowball prices, and if people don't sell, suddenly they start getting cited for violations of county codes they never heard of before. Most folks eventually cave. Your grandfather was one of the few holdouts. Well, I'm not selling, I said, surprising myself with the sudden conviction in my voice. Not after this. She built on our land, then tried to bully Grandpa out of his home with fake fines. I'm going to fight this." That evening I called Ben Hawkins, the lawyer Bill had recommended. He listened to my story in silence, occasionally grunting in what I hoped was agreement. When I finished, he said, "Victoria Reynolds has quite a reputation even in Billings. She's smart, ruthless, and usually gets what she wants. But moving boundary lines and building on someone else's property? That's not just aggressive business. That's fraud." He agreed to take the case but warned me it could be a long, expensive fight. Reynolds has deep pockets and isn't afraid to use them to bury opponents in legal fees. I spent that evening researching the upcoming Sun Valley HOA meeting, which was scheduled for the following week. According to their bylaws, which were posted on their website, non-residents could attend but not vote. I planned to be there, armed with Bill's survey and plenty of questions. In the meantime, I delved deeper into my grandfather's papers, trying to understand the full history of his conflict with Victoria. Among his journals, I found entries dating back 5 years, documenting each interaction, each new claim, each escalation. Reading his increasingly frustrated words made me even more determined to see this through. The Sun Valley clubhouse was everything I expected, tastefully upscale with stone fireplaces, exposed beams, and windows offering carefully framed views of the mountains. The irony that half of this building sat on my land wasn't lost on me as I took a seat in the back of the meeting room. About 50 residents were in attendance, a mix of retirees in golf attire and younger families who looked like they'd stepped out of a catalog for upscale casual wear. The atmosphere was one of comfortable privilege, people who were used to the finer things and expected their surroundings to reflect their status. Victoria presided at the front of the room, flanked by a thin, nervous-looking man she introduced as Gerald White, the HOA's legal counsel. Gerald had the perpetually anxious expression of someone used to cleaning up other people's messes, his fingers constantly adjusting his tie or glasses. The meeting began with reports on community improvements, discussions about a new landscaping contract, and debates about whether to allow a specific shade of beige for exterior paint. It was mind-numbing in its banality, but I could see how these small details mattered intensely to people who had invested heavily in creating their perfect suburban paradise. When the floor opened for community concerns, I raised my hand and introduced myself. "I'm Mike Carson, James Carson's grandson. I've recently discovered that a significant portion of this development, including half of this very clubhouse, appears to have been built on land that legally belongs to my family." A murmur ran through the crowd. Victoria's smile remained fixed, but her eyes hardened. "Mr. Carson is understandably emotional following his grandfather's passing," she said smoothly. "Unfortunately, he's been misled by an unreliable survey that contradicts the official development plans approved by the county." "I have the original property maps from 1952, I countered, plus confirmation from an independent surveyor with no ties to Sun Valley. I believe many of you are living in homes built on land that was illegally taken from my grandfather." Gerald White stepped forward, adjusting his glasses nervously. "These are serious allegations, Mr. Carson, potentially libelous ones. I'd advise caution before making such claims in a public forum." A woman in the third row stood up. She was about 40, with dark curly hair and an intense focus that reminded me of some of the best project managers I'd worked with in tech. "I'd like to see these surveys," she said. "I'm Dana Mitchell, an environmental attorney. I moved here 6 months ago, and if there are questions about the legal status of our properties, we should address them directly, not with threats." Victoria quickly cut in. "We'll be happy to address Mr. Carson's concerns through the proper legal channels. This isn't the appropriate venue for such discussions. Now, moving on to our next agenda item." As the meeting continued, I noticed Dana Mitchell watching Victoria with narrowed eyes, occasionally making notes on her phone. Several other residents were whispering among themselves, looking back at me with expressions ranging from hostility to concern. When the meeting ended, I found myself surrounded by a small group of residents. Some hostile, others concerned about what my claims might mean for their property values. "My family saved for years to build our dream home here," one man said angrily. "Are you saying we might not even own the land it's on?" "I'm saying Victoria Reynolds may have sold you land that wasn't hers to sell," I replied. "That's between you and her. I'm just trying to protect what belongs to my family." An older woman shook her head. "This is exactly why we left California. Too many lawsuits, too many regulations. We came here for peace and quiet." As I tried to answer their questions, I felt a tap on my shoulder. Dana Mitchell stood there, her expression inscrutable. "Here's my card," she said quietly, handing me a business card. "I think we should talk. There's a coffee shop 2 blocks from here. Tomorrow, 9 a.m.? I nodded and she slipped away. As I was leaving, a thick envelope was thrust into my hands by Gerald White. Consider this an official cease and desist regarding your disruptive behavior and defamatory statements, he said coldly. Additionally, the HOA board has voted to increase the fine on your property due to your grandfather's continued non-compliance. The new total is $300,000, due within 30 days. The coffee shop was busy when I arrived the next morning, but Dana had secured a corner table. She was dressed casually but expensively with the confident air of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. She wasted no time on small talk. I've suspected something was off about Victoria and this development since I moved in, she said after ordering. The HOA fees keep increasing for special projects that never materialize, and anyone who questions Victoria gets shut down immediately. I showed her Bill's survey and my grandfather's original property documents. She studied them carefully, occasionally nodding. This is compelling evidence, she admitted, but Victoria has deep pockets and connections throughout the county. Going head-to-head with her in court could take years and cost a fortune in legal fees. So what do you suggest? I asked, feeling defeated. Just let her steal my land and extort money from me? Dana smiled for the first time. Not at all. I think we need a more strategic approach. We don't need to fight the HOA itself, we just need to prove they have no authority over your land, and that they've been building on property they don't own. Over the next hour, Dana outlined a plan. Instead of a direct, legal confrontation, which could drag on for years, we would gather evidence of misconduct and bring it to light, both to the residents and to regulatory authorities, who wouldn't appreciate being misled about property boundaries on official documents. Victoria's power comes from her ability to control information and intimidate people, Dana explained. We need to break that control, and I think I know where to start. Over the next few days, Dana introduced me to Carlos Rodriguez, a construction worker who had worked on the initial phases of Sun Valley before quitting due to what he called shady practices. Carlos was in his mid-50s with deep laugh lines around his eyes that seemed at odds with his serious demeanor when discussing Victoria Reynolds. According to him, Victoria had repeatedly rushed construction timelines and ignored potential issues with property boundaries. There was this one time, Carlos told us as we sat on my porch, when one of the survey guys mentioned something about questionable markers near what's now the clubhouse area. Victoria took him aside, and the next day, he was off the project. New surveyor came in, suddenly everything was all clear. A lot of us thought it was strange, but jobs were scarce, you know. Would you be willing to make a statement about what you saw? Dana asked. Carlos hesitated. I still work construction in this county. Victoria has a long reach. I understand, I said, disappointed but not surprised. But, Carlos continued, surprising me, my cousin works in the county records office. Maybe he could help us look into those survey changes off the books, and I might know a few other guys from the project who saw things they didn't like. Our small team grew when Barb introduced me to Sheriff Tom Dawson, an old friend of my grandfather's. The sheriff was a tall, weathered man in his 60s, with the careful way of speaking that comes from decades of navigating small-town politics. He was officially neutral, but he didn't hide his personal feelings about Victoria. Your grandpa and I fished together for 30 years, he told me during a discreet meeting at the local diner. He was talking about this boundary issue last time I saw him, wanted to file a formal complaint but was gathering more evidence first. He lowered his voice. I can't officially take sides here, but between us, Victoria Reynolds has been throwing her weight around this county like she owns it. Wouldn't mind seeing someone finally stand up to her. Dana helped me develop a legal strategy. Instead of just fighting the HOA fines, we would assert our rightful ownership of the disputed land and demand compensation for its unauthorized use. Carlos agreed to provide a statement about the suspicious survey changes, and Sheriff Dawson promised to remain impartial if things escalated, despite the pressure Victoria could bring to bear. We decided to start slowly. First, we would formally contest the fines, with a letter from Dana explaining the boundary dispute. Then, once that got Victoria's attention, we would make our larger claim about the misappropriated land. As we expected, Victoria responded aggressively. 3 days after receiving our letter, she had Sheriff Dawson deliver a warning to me for creating a public nuisance after I placed private property signs near what I now knew was the true boundary of my land, cutting right through several Sun Valley backyards. Had to deliver this officially, Sheriff Dawson muttered as he handed me the citation, but off the record, she's worried. Been making calls to county commissioners trying to get them to pressure me to shut you down. He glanced around to make sure no one was listening. "Watch your back, son. Victoria doesn't play fair." That became even more evident when Victoria called a press conference on the steps of the county courthouse, declaring me a community agitator whose baseless claims threaten property values throughout the region. She painted herself as a champion of progress, being harassed by a bitter young man unable to accept change. "We welcome Mr. Carson to our community," she told the small gathering of local reporters, but his grandfather's refusal to maintain his property to reasonable standards, and now his grandson's attempts to disrupt a thriving neighborhood with frivolous claims, cannot be tolerated. Sun Valley represents the future of this county: jobs, tax revenue, and beautiful homes for families. We won't let one individual's misguided vendetta stand in the way of progress. We needed more concrete evidence of Victoria's deception. Dana suggested I pose as a potential buyer interested in one of the Sun Valley properties to get access to their sales office and documentation. Meanwhile, she filed a Freedom of Information Act request to obtain the original survey records from the county office. Carlos took the biggest risk, using his connections to access internal documents from the construction company's storage facility after hours. The pieces started coming together. From the sales office, I obtained marketing materials with property descriptions that contradicted their official submissions to the county. Dana's FOI request revealed that the original survey submitted to the county in 2019 had been quietly amended twice, each time pushing the boundary further into my grandfather's property. Most damning of all, Carlos found internal emails showing Victoria had been explicitly warned about boundary discrepancies, but had directed her team to handle it discreetly and adjust the documentation as needed. I tried taking this evidence to the local newspaper, but discovered Victoria was a major advertiser and had friendships with the owners. They declined to run the story, citing ongoing legal disputes. Frustrated but not defeated, I shifted tactics and created a Facebook page called The Truth About Sun Valley HOA, where I began posting our evidence, being careful to present facts rather than accusations that could be deemed libelous. The response was immediate. Current Sun Valley residents began asking questions, especially when I posted documents showing how their HOA fees were being used to fund Victoria's legal battles rather than community improvements. Some residents reached out privately, sharing their own frustrations with Victoria's leadership. A small group, led by Dana, began organizing to challenge Victoria's control of the HOA board. Victoria called an emergency HOA board meeting where she convinced them to increase their offer for my property to $1 million, well above market value, to resolve this unfortunate situation quickly and discreetly. I declined the offer publicly on the Facebook page, stating I wouldn't sell at any price until the fraudulent fines were canceled and the boundary issue addressed honestly. This turned out to be the push needed to attract wider attention. Sarah Chen, a reporter from a larger newspaper in the nearest city, reached out to me, interested in investigating what she called a David versus Goliath story about property rights and development. Sarah was in her early 30s, with the sharp, inquisitive manner of someone who took her journalistic responsibilities seriously. She spent days interviewing everyone involved, reviewing documents, and even tracking down former employees of Victoria's company, who confirmed the pattern of aggressive tactics and boundary manipulation. Sarah's comprehensive article, titled "Paradise at What Price? The Battle Over Sun Valley's Boundaries," ran on the front page of the Sunday edition. It presented all sides of the story, but included the damning evidence we'd gathered about the manipulated surveys and Victoria's threatening behavior. The article caught fire online, with property rights advocates and HOA critics nationwide sharing it widely. Victoria's response was swift and severe. She filed a $500,000 defamation lawsuit against me, claiming I was deliberately spreading falsehoods to damage her reputation and business. At the same time, a small group of Sun Valley residents, led by Dana, began formally questioning the HOA's financial decisions and Victoria's leadership. Gerald, sensing the changing winds, privately advised Victoria to consider a settlement, but she refused, convinced she could still crush what she called my pathetic rebellion. The case went before Judge Eleanor Simmons for a preliminary hearing. Dana represented me pro bono, presenting our evidence about the boundary dispute and arguing that all other issues, including Victoria's defamation claims, were secondary to establishing the proper property lines. Judge Simmons, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s with a reputation for fairness, carefully reviewed the competing surveys and historical records. Before this court can consider any claims of defamation or financial penalties, she declared, we must establish the factual matter of property ownership. I'm ordering a court-supervised survey of the properties in question, with representatives from both parties present. Until that's complete, no liens may be placed on Mr. Carson's property, and all fines are suspended pending resolution. She scheduled a full hearing for 3 months later, after the survey could be completed. Victoria was furious as we left the courtroom. "This changes nothing," she hissed as she passed me in the hallway. "I've invested too much in Sun Valley to let some tech bro with a nostalgia complex destroy it. My final offer: $2 million for your property, all disputes dropped, everyone walks away happy. Otherwise, I'll make sure this drags out in court until you're bankrupt, with or without Ms. Mitchell's free legal help." I was tempted by the offer. $2 million would set me up nicely back in Seattle, but something kept me from accepting, a combination of principle and a growing attachment to my grandfather's land. I told Victoria I needed time to consider her offer, but in reality I was following a new lead. While organizing my grandfather's home office, I discovered a hidden compartment in his desk containing documents I hadn't seen before. Among them was a contract from 1975 between my grandfather and a company called Western Water Resources, granting them mineral rights to extract groundwater from beneath the ranch in exchange for annual royalty payments. The contract had specific coordinates for the water rights, many of which were now under Sun Valley homes. What made this truly shocking was that Western Water Resources had gone bankrupt in the 1990s, and its assets, including this water rights contract, had been acquired by Cascade Development Group, which, according to the corporation records I found online, was Victoria Reynolds' parent company for all her development projects. Dana confirmed the contract was still legally binding, and Victoria would have known about it from her company's due diligence when acquiring Western Water's assets. The annual royalties hadn't been paid to my grandfather for years, meaning Victoria's company potentially owed the Carson estate hundreds of thousands, if not millions, in back payments. More importantly, the contract gave incontrovertible proof that she knew exactly where the true property boundaries lay. I requested a private meeting with Victoria, who agreed, likely assuming I was ready to accept her buyout offer. We met in her office, where I presented the water rights contract without preamble. "Where did you get this?" she demanded, her composure cracking for the first time as she recognized the document. "My grandfather kept better records than your company expected," I replied calmly. "You've known all along where the real boundaries are. You knew you were building on Carson land, and you knew your company owed my family years of royalty payments for water rights." Victoria's face hardened as she calculated her options. "What do you want?" "I want what's rightfully mine, the land, the back payments, and an acknowledgement of what you've done." She laughed, a cold, sharp sound. "Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? I've built this entire empire from nothing. I'm not about to let some farmer's grandson destroy it. I have ways of making problems disappear that don't involve courts, Mr. Carson." "Is that a threat?" I asked, my hand moving to my pocket where my phone was recording everything. Victoria waved dismissively. "I don't care if you're recording this. No one will believe you anyway. You think you're the first person to try to stand in the way of progress? They all fold eventually." Her voice dropped to a menacing tone. "One way or another." I left the meeting with exactly what I needed. Victoria on record threatening me and essentially admitting she knew about the boundary issues. Montana is a one-party consent state for recordings, meaning I could legally record our conversation as long as I was participating in it, and her statement about not caring if I recorded made it even more airtight. With all our evidence assembled, the original boundary documents, the manipulated surveys, Carlos's testimony about the cover-up, the water rights contract, and now Victoria's recorded threats, I was ready to make my final move. Since the 10 disputed acres were now officially acknowledged as not being part of the HOA's jurisdiction, I decided to host a public information meeting on my own land, right at the edge of the disputed area. I invited all Sun Valley residents, many of whom were now deeply concerned about the legal status of their properties. On a sunny Saturday afternoon, over 100 people gathered on the contested land. I had set up a simple podium and screen for projecting documents. Dana stood beside me as I methodically presented all our evidence, including Victoria's threatening statements from the recording. Victoria attempted to interrupt several times, but the residents themselves asked her to be quiet so they could hear the full story. When I finished, the atmosphere was tense. These people had invested their life savings in homes that might be partially built on illegally acquired land. They were angry, but their anger was now directed at Victoria, not me. "Here's what I'm proposing. I said, looking directly at Victoria, who stood rigid with fury at the back of the crowd. I won't pursue legal action for the back royalties on the water rights contract if 3 conditions are met. First, all HOA fines against my property are permanently canceled. Second, Ms. Reynolds resigns from the HOA board and divests her ownership stake in the remaining undeveloped portions of Sun Valley. And third, the new HOA board negotiates a fair lease agreement with me for the disputed land, ensuring you can all remain in your homes without legal uncertainty. The residents murmured among themselves, and Dana quickly explained that this was the most straightforward solution to a potentially years-long legal nightmare that could leave many of them in financial ruin. One by one, they voiced their support for my proposal. A middle-aged man in a golf shirt stood up. I bought my retirement home here 2 years ago. I'm not about to lose it because he pointed at Victoria, decided to cut corners and lie about property lines. I say we take Mr. Carson's deal. An elderly woman nodded in agreement. We moved here for peace and community, not to be pawns in someone's real estate empire. I second the motion. By the meeting's end, they had agreed to hold an official HOA vote at their next meeting, with most signaling they would approve the terms. The crowd gradually dispersed, many stopping to thank me for being reasonable about a situation that could have ended much worse for them. Gerald White, seeing an opportunity, quickly approached me afterward. I think this is a very reasonable solution, he said, as if he hadn't been threatening me with legal action just weeks earlier. I'd be happy to help draft the new lease agreement, pro bono, of course. I couldn't help but smile at his sudden change of heart. I think Dana has that covered, but thanks for the offer. Victoria hadn't moved from her spot at the back of the clearing, her face a mask of cold fury. When almost everyone had left, she approached me slowly, her designer heels sinking slightly into the soft earth of what was, legally, my land. "This isn't over," she said quietly. "You have no idea what you've started." I met her gaze steadily. "Actually, I didn't start anything. You did that when you decided to steal my grandfather's land. I'm just finishing it." She turned and walked away without another word, her rigid posture betraying the rage she was barely containing. The formal HOA vote was held the following week, and the outcome was decisive. Victoria was removed from the board, with Dana elected to replace her. All fines against my property were canceled, and a fair lease agreement was drawn up for the disputed land, providing me with a steady income while allowing the residents to keep their homes without legal complications. Victoria was forced to sell her ownership stake in the development and left the area, her reputation in tatters. Sarah's continued reporting revealed she had employed similar tactics in other communities, leading to broader investigations into her business practices and several more lawsuits from other property owners who had been similarly bullied. As for me, I decided not to sell the ranch after all. Using the income from the land lease, I began renovating the property into an agricultural education center for local children, fulfilling a dream my grandfather had mentioned in his journals. Over the following months, I learned more about ranching from Barb and other neighbors than I ever thought possible. I discovered that my tech skills were surprisingly useful in modernizing some aspects of the operation, creating irrigation systems that used sensors to conserve water, and developing a website that connected local farmers with regional buyers. The Sun Valley residents gradually built a positive relationship with the ranch, and the area developed in a more sustainable direction, with new zoning laws put in place to prevent similar boundary disputes. Some residents even volunteered at the education center, sharing their own expertise with the children who came to learn about agriculture and conservation. Barb became a regular visitor, helping me learn the basics of ranch management and sharing stories about my grandfather that helped me feel connected to my heritage. "James would be proud of you," she told me one evening as we sat on the porch watching the sunset. "Not just for standing up to Victoria, but for finding your place here. That's what he really wanted for you." I'd occasionally receive calls from other rural property owners facing similar situations with developers, and I'd share what I'd learned about standing up to corporate bullies. Dana and I created a small nonprofit offering legal advice to those who couldn't afford representation, funded partly by my lease income from Sun Valley. A year after our victory, we held a grand opening for the Carson Agricultural Education Center. The rundown barn had been transformed into a classroom space, and the fields now included demonstration plots for sustainable farming techniques. Local schools had already signed up for field trips, and we had a waiting list of children for our summer programs. Standing on the porch of the newly renovated farmhouse, looking out over fields where children would soon learn about sustainable farming, I felt my grandfather's presence. Beside the main gate, I hung a small sign with his favorite saying, "Never underestimate a farmer with an old map." Dana stood next to me, now a close friend and occasional legal advisor. "Your grandfather would be proud," she said, surveying what we'd built together. "You didn't just save his land, you gave it a future." "I never thought I'd end up here," I admitted. "When I lost my job in Seattle, I thought my life was falling apart. Turns out it was just leading me somewhere better." As the sun set over Montana's rolling hills, I knew I'd found something I'd never expected when I first drove up that gravel driveway. Not just a connection to my past, but a purpose for my future, and a community worth fighting for. Victoria Reynolds had thought she could bully another small landowner into submission, but she'd made one critical mistake. She'd built her empire on someone else's foundation, and sooner or later that kind of construction always comes tumbling down.